The studio lights had been burning since before dawn. In the sprawling soundstage of CBS Mornings, where the polished veneer of American television was manufactured fresh each morning, everything was in place. The curved desk gleamed under careful lighting, its surface wiped clean moments before the broadcast window opened. Two chairs sat angled toward each other at just the right distance, intimate enough to suggest conversation, formal enough to remind every viewer at home that this was still television, still a performance, still a space governed by invisible rules. The production crew moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this hundreds of times, adjusting earpieces, checking monitor feeds, murmuring into headsets. Somewhere behind the set, a guest was being prepped. Somewhere in front of it, a host was already becoming someone slightly larger than herself. Gayle King appeared on set at 6:42 in the morning, 18 minutes before the live broadcast would begin. She wore a deep navy blazer, tailored precisely, and her hair was swept back in a way that carried both warmth and authority. She smiled as she took her seat, exchanged a few words with a producer crouching at the edge of the frame, and then settled into the particular kind of stillness that comes from years of doing this. Not nervous stillness, not calm stillness, exactly. Something more like readiness. The kind of composure that is built over decades of live television, over thousands of moments where the script evaporated and something real flickered across a camera lens. She had earned every ounce of that steadiness, and on this particular Tuesday morning, she would need all of it. The guest that morning was Jason Momoa. His name had been announced the previous evening across the network's social channels, accompanied by a short promotional clip, and the response had been immediate and enthusiastic. Momoa carried a particular kind of cultural gravity in early 2026. He was still one of the most recognizable faces in American entertainment, still a figure who commanded attention whenever he entered a room, still someone whose presence could shift the energy of a space simply by existing within it. He had been busy. A new film was in the pipeline. A production company was expanding. He had been photographed at various events, had posted regularly online, had maintained the steady rhythm of visibility that modern stardom demanded. And yet there was something in the air that morning, something that hovered just beneath the surface of the promotional material in the cheerful on-air teasers, something that the producers knew about, and Gayle King certainly knew about, something that the interview had been quietly, carefully designed to approach. At 6:58, the stage manager gave the final count. The red light on the primary camera blinked on. Across the country, in living rooms and hotel rooms and offices where televisions were already tuned to the morning news, the familiar CBS Mornings intro sequence played. And then the studio filled the screen, and Gayle King turned toward the camera with a smile that was both genuine and practiced. And she said good morning, and the broadcast was live. And everything that was going to happen had already begun to happen, whether anyone in that room understood it yet or not. The first 20 minutes of the program moved with the comfortable rhythm of a well-rehearsed morning. There were other segments before Momoa appeared. A weather update, a brief piece on a cultural event in New York, a cooking segment that had been taped earlier but was presented with the same energy as everything else. Gayle King carried the transition smoothly, as she always did, her voice carrying that particular blend of authority and approachability that had made her one of the most trusted faces in American television for years. The studio felt warm. The lighting was soft. The audience, a modest but attentive group seated in the tiered section behind the cameras, was relaxed and receptive. This was the natural state of CBS Mornings on a Tuesday. Nothing about the atmosphere suggested that anything unusual was about to unfold. Jason Momoa walked onto the set at 22 minutes past 7. He entered from the left side of the stage, as guests always did, and he moved with the easy, slightly loping gait that had become something of a signature over the years. He was dressed simply. Dark jeans, a black jacket over a plain shirt. His hair was pulled back but not quite neat, carrying that deliberate casualness that celebrities often cultivated so carefully. He was smiling. The smile was wide and open, and when he reached the desk and turned to face Gayle King, he extended his hand with both of his own, holding hers for a beat longer than was strictly necessary, and the audience responded with a kind of warm applause that greeted a beloved figure. There was nothing guarded about him in those first seconds, nothing stiff or resistant. He lowered himself into the chair with a kind of loose physicality, one arm draped casually over the back of the seat, and he looked at Gayle King the way someone looks at a person they are genuinely pleased to see. Gayle King welcomed him with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. She thanked him for coming. She mentioned the film. She asked a light question about his schedule, about how busy things had been. Momoa answered openly, even laughing at one point. His body language completely relaxed. His shoulders were loose. His hands moved freely when he spoke. He leaned forward when he wanted to emphasize something, and he leaned back when he was listening. And the whole exchange had the texture of two people who were comfortable with each other, or at least comfortable enough to make the audience feel that way. The cameras captured it from multiple angles. Close-ups of Momoa's face showed a man who was present and engaged. Wide shots showed a studio bathed in warm light, two people sharing a moment that felt almost casual. It was during this early stretch that Gayle King began, almost imperceptibly, to steer. She did it the way she always did, which was to say she did it in a way that was nearly invisible. A question about the film led gently into a question about the kinds of roles he was choosing now, about what mattered to him at this point in his career. It was a perfectly reasonable question, the kind that any interviewer might ask a guest of his stature. But there was a precision to the way she framed it that was worth noticing, if you were watching closely. A specificity in the language, a slight forward lean in her posture that suggested she was not simply filling time. The audience did not notice. Most of the viewers at home would not have noticed either. But the producers in the booth, watching the monitor feeds, knew exactly what was happening. The conversation was beginning to move toward the place it had always been designed to bomb. By the 30-minute mark, the tenor of the exchange had shifted, though the shift was subtle enough that it might have gone unnoticed by a casual viewer. Gayle King's questions had become slightly longer, slightly more layered. She was still warm, she was still smiling, still nodding, still doing all the things that made her such an effective interviewer. But the questions themselves had acquired a new weight. She asked about his public life, about the way he had been perceived over the past year, about the kinds of conversations that had been happening around him in the media. Each question was fair. Each question was framed with care. None of them were accusations. None of them were confrontational in any overt way. And yet there was a direction to them now, a trajectory, and that trajectory was pulling the conversation somewhere that required Jason Momoa to be more than simply charming. Momoa's first response to the shift was almost invisible, a slight tightening around the eyes, a pause just a fraction of a second longer than his previous pauses had been before he began to speak. He answered the question. He answered it well, in fact, with the kind of articulate, thoughtful response that suggested he had been expecting something along these lines. He spoke about growth, about perspective, about how the public eye could distort things, could flatten a person into something simpler than they actually were. It was the kind of answer that worked on television. It was gracious and self-aware, and it gave the audience something to feel good about. But if you watched his hands during that answer, you might have noticed that they had stopped moving the way they had been moving before. They rested on his knees, one over the other, and they stayed there. Gayle King acknowledged what he had said. She nodded. She thanked him for his candor. And then she asked the next question, and this one was more direct. Not aggressive, not unkind, but direct in a way that the previous questions had not been. She asked about a specific period of time, a specific stretch of months during which certain stories had circulated, certain photographs had been published, certain conversations had taken place in public forums. She did not editorialize. She did not speculate. She simply asked what that experience had been like for him and what he wanted people to understand about it. It was a masterful question because it was impossible to answer without engaging with something real. And it was, in that moment, the first time in the interview that Jason Momoa looked as though he might not want to be in that chair. The pause that followed that question lasted approximately 4 seconds. On live television, 4 seconds is an eternity. The audience in the studio shifted slightly in their seats. One of the producers in the booth leaned forward. The camera operators held their frames steady, as they had been trained to do. Momoa's jaw moved, just slightly, as though he were turning something over in his mind, deciding how to arrange it, deciding how much of it to release. And then he spoke. He spoke carefully. He spoke in the measured, deliberate way of someone who was choosing every word with a precision that stood in sharp contrast to the ease with which he had been speaking minutes before. He did not answer the question directly. He acknowledged it. He validated the public's interest. He said something about how everyone deserved privacy, about how the media cycle worked in ways that were not always fair. It was a deflection, and everyone in the room knew it was a deflection. And Gayle King, who had been conducting these interviews for longer than most of the producers had been alive, knew it better than anyone. The atmosphere in the studio had changed. It had not changed dramatically, not in any way that would have been obvious from a wide shot or from a casual glance at the screen. The lighting was the same. The set was the same. The two people sitting at the desk were still facing each other in the same positions they had occupied for the past 15 minutes. But something had shifted beneath the surface, something that anyone who had spent time in a television studio would have recognized immediately. The air felt tighter. The silences between exchanges carried more weight. The crew members standing at the edges of the frame had gone very still. Even the audience, that quiet group of people seated behind the cameras, had settled into a quality of attention that was different from the relaxed receptivity they had carried at the beginning. They were watching now in the way that people watch when they sense that something is about to happen, even if they cannot yet articulate what that something is. Gayle King did not press. That was the remarkable thing about the way she handled the next stretch of the interview. She did not push harder. She did not raise her voice or sharpen her tone or do any of the things that a lesser interviewer might have done when a guest began to deflect. Instead, she simply held the space. She asked her next question with the same measured calm she had been using all morning. And the question itself was not substantially different in tone from the ones that had preceded it, but it was different in content. It addressed something specific, something that had been reported, something that had been discussed publicly. And it asked Momoa in the gentlest possible way to respond to it. Jason Momoa's posture changed. It changed in a way that was unmistakable to anyone watching closely, and the cameras were always watching closely. His shoulders, which had been loose and open for the first half of the interview, drew inward slightly. His spine straightened. His hands, which had been resting on his knees, lifted and clasped together in front of him, and they stayed clasped. His eyes moved from Gayle King's face to a point somewhere slightly above and to the left of her, and they stayed there for a moment before returning. It was the kind of body language that any behavioral analyst would have recognized immediately as a series of small, involuntary contractions. The body's quiet response to a stimulus it found uncomfortable. Momoa was not angry. He was not hostile. He was guarded. He was pulling inward in the way that a person pulls inward when they feel that the ground beneath them has become less stable than it was a moment ago. He answered the question. He answered it in a way that was technically responsive but emotionally opaque. He spoke about the importance of context. He spoke about how things looked from the outside versus how they felt from the inside. He spoke about his family, about the people who mattered to him, about how none of this was simple. And as he spoke, his voice carried a quality that had not been there before, a slight roughness, a slight tightness, that suggested he was working harder than he had been working to keep the conversation where he wanted it to be. Gayle King listened. She listened with the full, attentive focus that was one of her greatest gifts as an interviewer. She did not interrupt. She did not fill the silences with her own words. She simply waited, and she watched, and she let the moment exist as it was. It happened at 38 minutes into the broadcast. Gayle King asked a question. The question itself was not, by any objective measure, more provocative than the ones that had come before it. It was framed carefully. It was delivered with the same calm, measured tone she had been using throughout the interview. But it addressed something that landed differently than the previous questions had landed. It touched on something that Momoa had not yet been asked to address directly, something that had been circling the edges of the conversation for the past several minutes. And when the words left Gayle King's mouth and settled into the air between them, the studio seemed to contract around them. Jason Momoa did not answer immediately. He did not answer for 5 seconds. And then he did not answer for 5 more. The silence extended itself across the studio in a way that made it almost physical, almost tangible, a presence in the room as real as the two people sitting at the desk. The cameras captured everything. A close-up showed Gayle King's face, composed and attentive, her eyes steady on Momoa's, her expression carrying neither pressure nor pity, but something closer to genuine concern beneath its professional surface. Another camera showed Momoa. His jaw was set. His hands, still clasped, had tightened visibly, the knuckles carrying a faint pallor. His eyes were fixed on a point on the desk in front of him, and they were not moving. He was not thinking about what to say. He was not calculating or strategizing or performing. He was simply there, in that moment, with the full weight of it pressing down on him, and the cameras were recording every second of it, and millions of people were watching it happen in real time. The silence lasted 11 seconds. It was confirmed later by people who reviewed the broadcast footage frame by frame. 11 seconds of nothing but the ambient hum of the studio, the faint mechanical breath of the ventilation system, the almost imperceptible rustle of someone in the audience shifting in their seat. And then Momoa spoke. He said very little, a handful of words quietly, almost to himself, words that acknowledged the question without truly answering it. And then he stopped, and the silence returned. And Gayle King, in a moment that would be replayed and analyzed and discussed for weeks afterward, simply nodded, not the nod of someone who was satisfied with an answer, not the nod of someone who was moving the conversation forward, the nod of someone who understood exactly what was happening in that room, who had seen it happen before, who knew that there were moments in live television when the most powerful thing an interviewer could do was simply acknowledge that a human being was struggling and then let the struggle be visible. Jason Momoa stood up. He did not do it abruptly. He did not do it with anger or drama or any of the theatrical gestures that the moment might have invited. He simply unclenched his hands, placed them flat on his thighs for a moment, and then pushed himself up from the chair with a quiet, deliberate motion. He looked at Gayle King. The look lasted perhaps 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds there was something visible in his expression that resisted easy categorization. It was not anger, it was not shame, it was something closer to exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical tiredness, but from the effort of being watched, of being asked in front of millions of people to open something that he had spent a long time keeping closed. He nodded once, a small gesture that seemed to be directed at Gayle King specifically, and then he turned and walked off the set. He walked to the left, the same direction he had entered from, and his pace was unhurried. He did not rush. He did not stumble. He moved through the space with the same physical ease he had brought to the set when he arrived. But the ease was different now. Quieter, heavier, carrying a weight that had not been there before. A producer stepped into his path briefly, said something that the microphones did not pick up, and Momoa paused for just a moment before continuing. He disappeared around the edge of the set, and then he was gone. And the studio was left with the particular kind of silence that follows a departure that no one quite expected, and everyone, on some level, had been anticipating. Gayle King remained in her chair. She did not stand. She did not call after him. She did not turn to the camera immediately with an expression of surprise or concern or any of the performed reactions that the moment might have seemed to demand. She simply sat for a few seconds in the space where the conversation had been, and she let that space exist. And then she turned to the camera, and her expression was composed, and her voice was steady, and she said something brief and gracious about thanking Jason Momoa for his time. And she acknowledged that the interview had ended earlier than planned, and she did it all without a trace of sensationalism, without a single word that suggested she was anything other than a professional doing her job with care and dignity. The audience in the studio was very quiet. A few of them were looking at each other. None of them were looking at their phones. The moment had the texture of something shared, something witnessed together, something that felt, in that small room, like more than television. Within an hour of the broadcast ending, the clip had been viewed millions of times. The 11 seconds of silence had been isolated and shared across every major platform. The moment Jason Momoa stood and walked away had been screenshot and analyzed and turned into a dozen different kinds of content, some thoughtful, some reductive, most somewhere in between. The internet did what the internet always does with a moment like this, which is to say it amplified it, debated it, and turned it into something slightly larger and slightly less nuanced than it actually was. But beneath the noise, beneath the hot takes and the quick opinions and the algorithmic churn of social media, there was a genuine conversation happening. People were talking about what they had seen, not just the facts of it, not just the sequence of events, but the feeling of it, the texture of it, the way it had felt, even through a screen, to watch a human being reach the edge of something in public and then quietly, with as much dignity as the moment allowed, choose to step back from it. Gayle King's handling of the interview was discussed extensively in the hours and days that followed. The consensus among media professionals and critics was unanimous in its respect. She had not pushed too hard. She had not pulled back too early. She had asked the questions she was there to ask, and she had asked them with care. And when the moment came that required her to simply be present rather than to perform, she had done that too, and she had done it better than almost anyone else could have done it. Her restraint in the final moments, the knee deed, the brief and gracious sign-off, became a touchstone in conversations about what good interviewing looked like, about what it meant to treat a guest as a person rather than as content. It was the kind of moment that reminded people why certain journalists earned the trust they earned, and why that trust, once earned, carried a weight that no amount of social media engagement could replicate. The broader conversation that emerged from the broadcast was more complicated, more layered, more resistant to easy resolution. People debated the ethics of live television, the responsibility of networks, the line between journalism and entertainment, the ways in which public figures were simultaneously entitled to privacy and obligated to transparency. They debated what Momoa's departure meant, what the silence had meant, what any of it meant beyond the immediate moment. Some of these conversations were productive, some of them were not, but all of them circled back eventually to the same central image. Two people sitting across from each other in a room full of cameras, one of them asking a question with grace and precision, the other one sitting with that question in silence, and then standing up and walking away and leaving the room and the broadcast and the moment behind him. It was, in the end, a very simple scene, a person being asked something difficult, a person choosing not to answer, in a room full of witnesses, human and electronic alike, holding the weight of what had just happened between them.